Hello, honeys. It is Tuesday, and you know what that means. We have a brand new Beesness for you, number 87, in fact. Our newest Art World updates will span from October 19th through the 25th, and if you'll recall, I spent the last half of that week on vacation with family, which was a wonderful time. Very restful and restorative, plus I got to play with the family dog, who is basically my baby. But one of the coolest and most creative parts of the trip was going to see all together a speakeasy performance of Edgar Allan Poe. So with each round of stories, and there were 4 stories, there was a round of appropriately themed drinks. For example, during the reading of Cask of Amontillado, we had a drink that had Amontillado in it. Super neat experience. 10 out of 10 would go while they're still running in Knoxville. And now, without further ado, the episode. First and foremost, some follow-ups. We learned Andrea Gaiarotti has stepped down from her position as the director of the Weissman Museum at Pepperdine University 3 weeks after the administration controversially obscured works with anti-ICE, pro-Palestine, and other political messages. Protest art created at a student protest event October 9th will be used again in an October 29th demonstration outside the Elkins Auditorium, wherein faculty will be meeting to discuss recent events at the Weissman Museum. Said Pepperdine senior Grace Bidewell to our sources, quote, "It doesn't align with their beliefs as a school. Christ had the view that all beings were created equal. Having artwork that respects that view shouldn't be a problem," end quote. And those sentiments were shared by many other affiliates of the school that were quoted by our sources. Meanwhile, the British Museum's controversy-plagued ball raised $3.3 million. The event, dubbed London's answer to the Met Gala, raised more than £2.5 million, with the proceeds, quote, "securing vital funding for our international partnerships," end quote, according to the museum's statements. The $2,700 a ticket fundraising event was attended by celebrities and prominent names like Mick Jagger, Janet Jackson, Tracy Emin, Naomi Campbell, and featured a silent auction. But as I mentioned, there was still scandal. One unidentified woman who snuck in dressed as a waiter was seen standing on the stage next to George Osborne, chair of the museum's board of trustees, holding up a sign reading "Drop BP Now" in a video posted online by Energy Embargo for Palestine, a British-based organization, during his speech. And very shortly after the ball, Greece's culture minister, Lina Mendoni, criticized the British Museum's, quote, "provocative indifference," end quote, in allowing the 800 or so guests to get so rowdy very near the Elgin Marbles. It seems the British Museum is still counting this as a win. Last week also saw a woman charged over the theft of gold worth $1 million from the Paris Natural History Museum. A 24-year-old Chinese national has been arrested and charged over the theft that took place just weeks before the Louvre heist. She was picked up by authorities in Barcelona, Spain on September 30th and handed over to French police on October 13th. They then charged her with theft and criminal conspiracy and placed her in provisional detention. Right, our sources, quote, Paris prosecutor Laura Bacau told the press that at the time of her arrest, she was attempting to dispose of nearly 2.2 pounds of melted gold pieces, end quote. The investigation and the manhunt for other participants in the early morning break-in and subsequent robbery is ongoing. And now here, honeys, you may be expecting me to talk about the Louvre heist. Who hasn't been talking about the Louvre heist? But honestly, honeys, it would take up half of a Beesness to explain that case in all its complexity. So, bonus treat time for you. For our final follow-up, you will be able to redirect your attention to a Louvre heist special dropping later this week. Be sure and stay tuned. And bringing it back, we learned that a Kraftwerk co-founder's vintage electronic gear and ephemera are going up for auction. The electronic pop group founded in Germany in the 1970s by Florian Schneider and Ralf Hutter started as a radical post-war group and grew into this international pop culture phenomenon that literally changed music's composition, design, engineering, and overall sound forever. Schneider passed away in 2020 at the age of 73, and his collection is now hitting the auction block on November 19th at the Musicians Hall of Fame and Museum in Nashville, but it's also open for online bidding right now. Not only will it offer musical equipment like synthesizers and flutes, but also things like a 1964 Volkswagen van and a road bike ridden by Schneider in a music video. Last week's headlines also announced that Japan's Okada Museum is being forced to sell some artworks to settle its founder's $50 million legal debts. Okada, an 83-year-old billionaire, is the former chairman of Tokyo-based Universal Entertainment Corp., whose multi-million-dollar bill stems from his long-running feud with casino magnate Steve Wynn. Sotheby's Hong Kong will sell the 125 works on the museum's behalf on November 22nd. We noticed this headline because I immediately questioned the fairness of this decision. in the sense of the loss of public access. We also noticed it because, as Nicholas Chow, Sotheby's Asia chairman and worldwide head of Asian art, told Art News, quote, "This is the most significant collection of East Asian art to come to auction in recent memory. The Okada collection stands as an unrivaled assemblage of East Asian art today, and it is an extraordinary privilege for Sotheby's to be offering it," end quote. And that praise is well earned. The collection includes Katsushika Hokusai's iconic The Great Wave off the coast of Kanagawa from 1832, a rare Qianlong 8 treasures vase, and a pair of 16th century 6-panel screens by Kanu Motonobu from the Muromachi period, all of which are expected to sell for millions of dollars apiece. Speaking of Sotheby's, they broke some pretty major surrealist records in Paris last week, recording the highest ever totals in France for surrealist and modern art auctions on Friday, by which point its surrealism and its legacy, as well as modernité's sales, had made a combined 89.7 million euros or 104 million US dollars. This is potentially a good sign for the art market. It represents a 50% increase from the same doubleheader auction series last year and was also the second highest total ever for a surrealist auction at Sotheby's in France. Also notable from those sales, Amedeo Modigliani's Elvira in bust from 1918 through 19 became the most expensive Modigliani work sold in France and the most valuable piece of any kind sold by Sotheby's Paris at 27 million euros or 31.3 million US. And one final headline from last week to round out this category, the Art Basel/UBS collecting report this year shows the growing influence of women and Gen Z collectors. Our sources write, quote, "The report offers quantitative proof of something the art world has sensed for years. The future of collecting no longer belongs to a small fraternity of boomer patrons," end quote, as the study, conducted across 10 markets with 3,100 high net worth collectors, found nearly 3/4 of the respondents are Gen Z or millennials who, quote, "are more global, more digital, and more comfortable collapsing the boundaries between art, design, fashion, and technology," end quote. The key part of these findings is not only the demographic shifts and the impacts of them, but the entire rethinking of collecting approaches going on. Quote, "For them, collecting isn't merely ownership, it's participation," end quote, as these young collectors now, quote, "allocate an average of 26% of their wealth to art, the highest share of any age group," end quote, and direct those funds not only towards traditional arts, but digital works, luxury goods, and sports assets. As anyone who knows me personally, has seen any of my art wall reels, or even has listened to a personal pinup knows, 26% is maybe only slightly higher than what I spend on art. But still, it's heartening to see these reconsiderations, these breaking of traditional molds, and that high level of arts participation and respect. Our next story, honeys, you're never gonna believe it. Another French museum was robbed right after the Louvre heist. According to the South China Morning Post, just hours after the Louvre's robbery, nearly 2,000 gold and silver coins were taken during a nighttime burglary at the House of Enlightenment Denis Diderot in Londres. These reports were confirmed by local authorities not long after. Investigators are examining similarities to other museum robberies in the recent months, including hits at the Jacques Chirac Museum in Saran, the National Adrien Dubouche Museum in Limoges, and the Natural History Museum in Paris, but have not publicly stated whether or not these instances are connected. James Ratcliffe, director of recoveries at the Art Loss Register, suggested the thieves were, quote, "opportunists rather than specialists," end quote, though, taking advantage of outdated security systems because, quote, "it's not necessarily difficult to get into historic institutions like the Louvre," end quote, nor the House of Enlightenment, which is a mansion dating back to the 16th century, and were built for flair and not function. But I personally find it notable and suspicious that the other institutions that were hit fall into this category as well. We also learned the Vatican will return some cultural objects to indigenous groups in Canada, which include an Inuit kayak and have been housed in the Anima Mundi Museum, aka the Vatican Museum's ethnographic collection. Vatican and Canadian authorities said to expect a more detailed formal announcement in the weeks to come, and that these objects could be in Canada before the end of 2025. They also specified it would most likely be a quote-unquote church-to-church model, like the one used to return Parthenon marble fragments to Greece in 2023. Technically, that means the process would be described as a donation by Pope Francis to a local archbishop or other figurehead, not a state-to-state government-affiliated repatriation. And that figure will then be responsible for ensuring the ultimate custodians are the appropriate indigenous communities. We care about this, honeys, because it's being done as part of a, quote, continued reckoning with the role the Catholic Church played in the oppression of indigenous groups in the Americas Americas, end quote, as our sources describe it. It is also being done in cooperation with indigenous advocates who say that cultural heritage stolen during colonial periods should be returned. We also got wind that Brazil's Almeida and Dale Gallery was raided by police in connection with missing Alfredo Volpi works last week. Almeida and Dale is one of Brazil's most prominent galleries, while Volpi himself was a Brazilian modernist celebrated for his vibrant abstract paintings. He passed away in 1988. Our story really starts with an accusation by the artist's estate against the co-founder Carlos Dale. The estate says that Dale was not authorized to sell 3 works back in 2006, which they reported as stolen in 2008, but the gallery claimed no wrongdoing on its part in a statement posted to Instagram and said those issues were due to mistakes in designations of the legal custodians of the artworks that they are currently working to correct. All the same, Sao Paulo's State Department of Criminal Investigations subsequently showed up on October 22nd at the gallery's branch in the Jardins neighborhood with a search warrant regarding the paintings, one of which is valued at 6.4 million real or 1.2 million US dollars. Art Review reported that a laptop was taken away, but no artworks were ultimately seized. And ArtNet News drew our attention to the fact that after over a year in detainment, Chinese artist Gao Zhen is in failing health and still without a trial. Gao was once part of an artist duo with his brother and gained some fame and notoriety for creating politically charged sculptures, paintings, and performances, mostly challenging communist orthodoxies, and was arrested last year in China on, quote, suspicion of slandering China's heroes and martyrs, end quote. In a public release in early October, Human Rights Watch called for the Chinese government to drop the quote-unquote baseless charges against Gao, stating that he is in quote-unquote poor health and fainted last month. Art News writes, quote, as Human Rights Watch noted, the supposedly offending artworks, 118 pieces taken from Gao's studio in Sanhe, a city in northern China, in November of 2024, were created between 2005 and 2009, long before Xi Jinping entered office in 2013, let alone the cited laws in 2018 or 2021, end quote. Gao's family told the nonprofit that he's currently being held in a 430 square foot cell with 14 other detainees and still no trial date has been announced. A doctor at the detention center, they claim, also said that Gao may have arteriosclerosis, which could be a precursor to a stroke, and that he suffers from chronic back problems. According to reports, Gao has sent a letter through his lawyer to Ai Weiwei, the famed dissident Chinese artist who was similarly held for 81 days without a charge back in 2011, saying that he sees many parallels in their experiences and noting the contrasting level of media attention that each case has received. So consider this our attempt to advocate for him and remedy that a little bit. Back in the States, according to Columbia media outlets, staff at the Wexner Center for the Arts, part of Ohio State University, sent a letter of no confidence in the leadership of Executive Director Gaetan Verne to university officials on August 25th. It was signed by 13 out of 70 employees, but 27 union-repped employees have their own grievance processes so weren't presented with it, making it more like 13 out of 43. Notably, the letter was sent at the same time the institution came under scrutiny, quote, following reports that high attrition, financial struggles, and workplace dysfunction under Verne's leadership had deteriorated staff morale, end quote. The letter went on to cite old and new examples of alleged fiscal irresponsibility, quote, such as the university issuing the center a quote-unquote red card for financial turmoil and the launch of a major capital project with a reported budget of $1 million said to lack, quote, transparent budgeting, staff consultation, or a completed feasibility study, end all quotes. We'll let you know when we hear more. We also learned that the New York City arts nonprofit called Canal Projects is closing after only 4 years. The nonprofit art space was established by the Korean American community building organization Y.S. Kim Foundation in a 19th century cast iron building at the edge of New York's Chinatown, but it announced that it will close its physical location on May 23rd of next year and transition immediately into a grant-making and funding body with the aim of distributing $3 million towards scholarships, fellowships, and exhibitions over the span of 2026 through 2029. And going back to France once again this episode, a dozen demonstrators gathered outside the Centre Pompidou in Paris on Wednesday, October 22nd, to protest a daytime fireworks performance by Kai Gao-chiang that had been staged to mark the museum's 5-year closure for renovations. They additionally called for a boycott over his controversial stunt in the Himalayas earlier this year. Kai has been in hot water for a little while here. Backlash over a similarly disruptive 2024 performance in California escalated this September, though, after the artist was commissioned by the outdoor brand Arc'teryx to stage a fireworks display titled Rising Dragon at 18,000 feet on a mountain ridge in the Tibetan Himalayas. Himalayas. The show was later accused, however, of causing damage to the vulnerable high-altitude ecosystem despite the company's claims that quote-unquote biodegradable materials were used and livestock were relocated. The stunt ultimately ignited global outrage, particularly among Tibetan communities who saw it as a profound act of disrespect towards the sacred mountains and local traditions and framed it as an indefensible act of cultural violence. 4 Chinese officials were dismissed as a result. We're focusing on the headline because the activists were not only arguing against Kai himself, they were arguing against the use of fireworks, saying that it commodifies Tibetan culture and spirituality, turning sacred spaces into marketing spectacles. Said Students for Free Tibet France, the group behind the Pompidou demonstration, in an email to Hyperallergic, quote, "Tibet is not a stage for corporate spectacle," end quote. This is also the most recent in a series of staged protests at Paris museums over issues related to Tibet and Tibetan identity. There was huge uproar over the perceived erasure of Tibetan identity and heritage last year at the Musée des Quai Branly in Paris when it labeled its Tibetan artifact collection as originating from the Xinjiang Autonomous Region, a term used by the Chinese government for Tibet. We're also thinking of the filing of a legal complaint against the Musée Guimet by 4 pro-Tibetan groups in France over the renaming of its Nepal Tibetan galleries to the more generic Himalayan world earlier this year. Both of these protest instances hinged on the argument that the moves effectively aligned with China's broader efforts to suppress Tibetan culture, history, and political identity. Speaking of institutional criticism, the Obamalisk is facing some early bits of it. As the New York Times reports, not everyone is so pleased about the quote-unquote chunky obelisk-like structure going up on Chicago's South Side, nicknamed the Obamalisk. Many notable artists have been working on the site, including Julie Mehretu, Maya Lin, Kiki Smith, Nika Cave, Richard Hunt. Obama told the Times, quote, "I'm more interested in how can we use this space to activate people and get them to feel inspired about making a difference in their own communities, to create a center for community life in a place that frankly has often been neglected," end quote. Leaving aside some critiques of the actual structure, the style of the Obamalisk, some locals are still worried about the privatization of public park land, as well as the potential that the project will gentrify the neighborhood. Asked Dixon Romeo, executive director of the group Southside Together, quote, "How do we ensure that the city of Chicago does not let this be another case of something that was supposed to help Black folks actually hurt them," end quote. Last week also saw historic preservation groups request a pause on Trump's ballroom construction at the White House. The National Trust for Historic Preservation sent a letter Tuesday of last week to the National Capital Planning Commission, the National Park Service, and the Commission of Fine Arts with concerns about the size of Trump's proposed new ballroom. They've asked the administration to pause construction until the building plans can be reviewed, even as demolition began on the east wing of the historic house earlier this week. It reads in part, quote, "While the National Trust acknowledges the utility of a larger meeting space at the White House, we are deeply concerned that the massing and height of the proposed new construction will overwhelm the White House itself. It is 55,000 square feet and may also permanently disrupt the carefully balanced classical design of the White House with its 2 smaller and lower east and west wings," end quote. It goes on to highlight guidelines laid out by the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Rehabilitation, stressing, quote, that new additions should not destroy the historic fabric of the property and that new work should be compatible with existing massing, size, scale, and architectural features, end quote. The headline's notable because it echoes concerns that the Society of Architectural Historians cited in their statement last week, as well as those of the American Institute of Architects in their August letter to the Trump administration. However, none of these bodies have the power to stop the project, only dissuade its growth. This could be a problem if the project does indeed continue expanding. Furthermore, these massive renovations are going on as the second longest government shutdown in U.S. history continues, the first longest occurring under Trump's first presidential term, and since they also precede the 250th anniversary of the founding of the U.S. of A., it puts even more stress and attention on this project and its timeline. I can't lie, this brings up an issue of priorities for me here. Seems like we should, get the government operating again before knocking shit down and rebuilding all willy-nilly. Sometimes I think back to when I started this podcast and I promised myself I would not let my political beliefs appear Oh, how times have changed. In other headlines, a new study has found that King Tut's tomb is at risk of collapse. Syed Hameda, a researcher in the Architectural Conservation Department at Cairo University, used geotechnical modeling and Plexus 3D software to calculate stresses and deformation patterns in the tomb and published his findings earlier this year in the journal Nature. Hameda found the tomb was relatively stable in dry conditions, but suggests, quote, reducing moisture fluctuations, unquote, throughout the tomb to further stabilize the structure and reduce further deterioration, quote, which can be achieved by limiting air circulation inside and around the tomb, end quote. Hameda also recommended, quote, a well-focused strengthening and retrofitting program, end quote, to address further concerns. And the headline's notable because the research from this study can be applied as insights into or a guide for preservation efforts at comparable sites suffering from similar or related issues. Meanwhile, a few thousand miles away, a 5,500-year-old ritual site found in Jordan offers new insight into an ancient cultural collapse. Discovery of it was made by a team from the University of Copenhagen during an excavation at Murray-Gat, an archaeological site in the arid hills of central Jordan, which features 95 dolmens or stone burial monuments dated to 4,500 to 3,700 BCE. At that point, the Copper Age gave way to the early Bronze Age. According to Suzanne Kerner, project leader and archaeologist at the University of Copenhagen, their construction likely began as a communal response to the collapse of the Chalcolithic culture or Copper Age and climate change as well. She wrote, according to our sources, quote, the monuments and their visibility across the landscape may have acted as markers of identity and territory. Murray-Gat gives us a glimpse into how early societies redefined themselves by building monuments and creating new forms of community when traditional systems failed, end quote. Last week also saw the man known as the first Black surrealist get his due at Art Basel Paris. London's The Gallery of Everything wanted to show the work of late self-taught Haitian painter Hector Hippolyte, who is today considered a pioneering artist associated with the movement, at the event 3 years ago but was denied. Now the gallery has finally brought his work to the fair and opened it to the public on October 24th. The solo booth in the fair's premise sector features works by Hippolyte, including 3 previously featured in Le Surrealisme in 1947, a historic exhibition that appeared in Paris that year. The showing stands out because it's being billed as the artist's first survey in a European commercial setting, and shows like these are increasingly helping to bridge the gap between high art and low art, as well as who is considered to belong in each category. In other words, it speaks to representation and to breaking down elitism in the art world. And last but not least, a few fond farewells to some legends that passed away last week. Tony Fitzpatrick, who was born in 1958, a painter, printmaker, muralist, and writer who ran a number of galleries in the city of Chicago, including the Edge, World Tattoo, and the Dime. He was, quote, a tireless advocate of the city, end quote. Another was Brian Harris, born 1952. He was a, quote, British photojournalist who captured the arc of the 20th century, end quote, through historical milestones like the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and famine in Ethiopia and Sudan for publications including The Times of London, The Sun, and The Guardian. Another for Giles Lorraine, a photographer born in 1938 who captured stars, superstars, and 70s drag culture in such cult classics as his 1973 book Idols. We will also miss Gabriel Ramirez Aznar, born 1938 as well, a Mexican painter, writer, and, quote, pillar of Yucatan art, end quote. Rest in peace to Frank Rimberly, born 1926. Our sources write the artist's life was, quote, marked by a devotion to experimentation and an excitement for creative possibility, end quote. And we will pour one out for Carla Stellweg, born 1942, and described as a, quote, fearless curator and writer who shifted the very ground of Mexican contemporary art at a critical juncture for the country's history and identity, end quote. That is our buzz for the week, honeys. Please feel free, as always, to DM us with any questions, any comments or concerns, but hopefully not too many of the latter. Remember to catch that Louvre special dropping later this week, and remember to head over to Patreon to catch our newest 5-minute musical. There seemed no more appropriate video to do for October than Michael Jackson's Thriller, so if you want to know the full story behind that iconic music video, be sure to head on over to our Patreon page on Halloween. Until then, honeys, take care, hydrate or dihydrate. We'll be talking soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.